Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Queen's Gambit accepted with pawn to e3, which is known as the old variation, which is solid for white, has positional disadvantages as we are going to see, and can be tricky for black if black is easily confused by move orders and if black is not prepared well. However, most likely e3 is going to transpose to main lines with knight f3, which we are going to be covering in the next video. So let's first get into the opening. So d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit. And the idea of the Queen's Gambit, of course, is to gain control over the e4 square, undermining black's center. Now, in most normal games, black either plays the QGD or the Slav, leading either to the semi-Slav or some other opening, supporting his center, but in this series we are looking at d takes c4, which is the accepted Queen's Gambit, and black basically takes a pawn which is more than likely going to be regained, but black gives up the center. Now what's the idea? The idea is, should white expand, as we saw yesterday with e4, there are various ways to undermine that center and to attack that center, and white still has to waste time to take the pawn. So after d takes c4, black has one main plan. While white is regaining his pawn, black is going to break through that center and equalize. Now I have to say, in my studies of the Queen's Gambit accepted, I have realized that in most lines, it's an opening with which black fights to equalize, not to have an opening advantage, not to play for tricky variations, which means that it's not suited for aggressive players. You aggressive players should play the Dutch or the King's Indian or something else. But it equalizes fairly comfortably, and that's what I think makes it very annoying for the Queen's Gambit player to face. Because if you don't have an opening advantage with white, well, then you having white doesn't amount to much. Now, why does black equalize? Well, it's very likely that these pawns at some point in various different move orders are going to be traded off. And once these pawns are traded off, the pawn structure will be symmetrical, boring, and equal, and it will be very hard to create winning chances for either side. Furthermore, the queens are highly likely to get traded off. Okay, so today we are looking at pawn to e3, which is a sideline, but the second most popular move. The most popular move is knight f3, of course. Now, what's the advantage of knight f3? Well, you play knight f3 and you live with the fact that you are not regaining your pawn just yet. So as we are going to see in the next video, there are options for black to try and fight for that pawn and try to keep it and complicate matters for white. On the other hand, the move knight f3 prevents black's main attacking idea in the center, and that's pawn to e5. And if you are familiar with the Grunfeld defense, the concept is fairly similar. You allow white to have a big center, but then you break that center open. The same idea can be said of the Queen's Gambit accepted. The only difference is that the bishop is not on g7, so putting pressure on the center throughout this diagonal, but black wants to break the center with the moves c5 and e5. So when you play knight f3, e5 is automatically defended against. In this line with pawn to e3, e5, as we can see, is not defended against, and that's going to be the main move we will look at. So firstly, let's have a look at all the options black has at his disposal. So firstly, and I'm going to be covering this opening from the white perspective because the old variation is a variation chosen by white. So the main move is, of course, knight f6. And after knight f6, we are going to be transposing to the main lines. So I'm not going to be spending time on this. White simply regains the pawn, black plays pawn to e6. And now by far the most common move for white is knight to f3. And we have transposed to the main line. If white chooses not to play knight f3 on this turn, then another transposition could occur after knight c3. Pawn to a6, preparing to push the bishop away with b5. White plays the move a4, black plays c5, breaking the center, and knight f3. And now again we have transposed to knight f3 variations. One sideline that I would like to mention after bishop takes c4, e6 is queen to e2, which can lead, queen to e2, which can lead to complications. This avoids a queen trade. And after c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5. Now white, of course, has a choice of playing knight to f3, which is the main move. But now the center has already liquidated and we have avoided a queen trade. And this is an independent line. But this is so extremely boring that I actually don't want to be looking at this too much. And actually, we are going to transpose to knight f3 in a matter of moves, almost regardless of what both players play, because all natural moves lead to the main lines. Now here, I would just like to emphasize the pawn structure. It's completely symmetrical, and it's 2-on-2 on the queen side, 4-on-4 on the king side, which makes it very hard to gain an advantage for either color. And furthermore, both sides have fairly natural development. The bishop is coming to b7, so for example b5, and the bishop drops back to d3, and now either bishop b7 or knight c6 or knight b to d7, normal development. So knight f6, which is the main response to e3, will lead to knight f3 lines. Of course, all players who play the Queen's Gambit Accepted have to be familiar with the main line. So we are going to be covering that tomorrow. The second option I would like to look at is e6, which is again going to transpose to the main lines after bishop c4, knight f6, and we have reached the same position. One fun variation I would like to look at briefly, which transposes to the modern Slav defense. So if you are unfamiliar with that, watch the video on the modern Slav, is bishop e6. Now this is trying to defend the pawn by brute force. So white continues knight f3, you play c6. The idea is, of course, to play the move b5, defending your pawn permanently and, well, freeing up this bishop. But after a4, we are now in the modern Slav defense, and you can watch that video for this variation. It continues knight f6 most likely, knight a3, c5 breaking the center, knight takes c4, and it should be equal after something like knight c6, knight c5, cd4, bishop b5. So bishop e6 again transposing to a different opening. Now, one line that I also have to mention, which we are going to be focusing on tomorrow, is a6, preparing b5, chasing the bishop away at some point. And after bishop c4, knight f6, knight f3, we are now in the a6 line of the main line. So this will start not with e3, but with knight f3, knight f6, e3, a6, bishop c4, and e6, so transposing to the main lines again. And now we will be having a look at three independent lines which are relevant for this opening alone. So this you have to know as black and as white. As white if you want to play the old variation, and as black if you play the Queen's Gambit Accepted. The first one I would like to look at is b5. Now, this I wouldn't recommend, but if white doesn't know what he's doing, he could end up being a pawn down for the rest of the game. It's very important here to break open the black structure straight away. So white plays the move a4. If you try to defend that pawn, well, for example, pawn to c6. Whoa. Okay, takes, and now you can continue. You can continue with knight to c3, and if the pawn advances, then you have queen to a4, and you pick up the pawn. The c4 is dropping, the a7 pawn is dropping off, and this is bad. So after b5, a4, black doesn't have a way to defend this pawn, so black has to advance with pawn to b4. And after bishop takes c4, e6, what you have gained is you have taken away squares from the b1 knight, you have also freed up the b7 square for your bishop, but your pawn structure is loose. And after knight f3, knight f6, white castles, black plays bishop to e7, white continues knight b to d2, trying to play e4 at some point. Bishop b7, queen e2, black castles, e4, c5. I don't see equality for black. I would say that white is always slightly better here after knight d5 and knight e4. And now here is why. White has a fairly natural attack and has squares from which he could launch his attack. That's d6 and f6, supported by the e5 pawn. Often, if you have read My System by Nimzovich, you know that the pawn on e5 is sort of a start of a successful attack most often, and having a pawn on e5 helps a lot. So you are controlling g5, with your knight you are controlling f6, your queen can come to h5. So while on the other hand, black has a prospect to create a passed pawn on the queen side, but that's very far-fetched. Black also is yet to develop his queen side pieces, and I don't like the move b5. It's sort of a trick. If white doesn't know what he's doing, you could do well, but as soon as white plays a4, you are slightly worse for the rest of the game. So now let's have a look at two good independent lines. The first one is pawn to c5. So breaking the center straight away. And from c5, we are going to look at a very important pawn structure for this opening, which occurs after white regains his pawn and black takes. White, of course, takes with the pawn. Trading the queens off would leave him with an isolated queen's pawn position with the queens traded off, which reduces the attacking potential significantly, of course. And when one side has an isolated queen's pawn, and I've talked about this before, the side with the isolated queen's pawn has two options. Option one, which is far more common, is create attacking chances on this diagonal on the f7 square using the e5 square and the c5 square, which are made available but by the isolated queen's pawn on d4 to launch an attack. So that's option one. Option two is get rid of the isolated queen's pawn by pushing d5. More common in the Queen's Gambit accepted is liquidating the pawn in more variations, but there are also attacking possibilities. In this position, black's most common is queen c7, attacking the bishop. The bishop could drop back to e2. It's more common to leave it on b3 on this diagonal looking at f7. So bishop to b3. And now black has an annoying move for white to face. Black has this move bishop g4. And of course, if knight to f3 is played, then you can simply take, and white is forced to take with the pawn. If white takes with the queen, then of course queen takes c8 would be a losing position. So this would be this pawn structure. If black can develop, is just lost for white. So after bishop to g4, white has to play pawn to f3, which is another positional concession. And after the bishop drops back to d7, of course, white has open pieces. After something like knight e2, e6, bishop f4, the queen is driven away, bishop d6, queen to d2 defending, and knight f6. But black can develop in time and will not run into any difficulties. So castles, castles, bishop to c6, rook f to d1, rook to d8, for example. And now the idea is clear. White wants to play d5. You're not launching an attack because your knight is not on f3. This diagonal is sufficiently defended. So if you can play d5 and liquidate your pawn, that's going to be good. You can play moves like rook c1 and then slowly prepare d5. Here, black already has to be careful. If black plays a nothing move, then d5. And if takes, your bishop is pinned. So you would have to do this, and then you lose. Yeah. Okay. So that's c5, and that's a very interesting variation. So it's not the one I would recommend, but it leads to interesting positions after this move queen c7 and this annoying idea with bishop to g4. So let's have a brief look at bishop e2 that stops bishop g4. Now here no issues for black actually. After knight f6, knight c3, black can continue with normal development, something like e6, knight f3, you can play bishop e7, white castles, black castles, and now again, white is the one who has to force through d5, therefore bishop g5, and getting rid of this defender of the d5 square. And black has no easy way to defend against that. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, these two pawns are about to be traded off. There's nothing black can do about it. What black has, excuse me for that, is complete equality. This once these, okay, let me just put something on the board. Okay, let's say this happens, and let's say white takes. Okay, and let's say black does nothing and white goes back. So obviously you can see that the only difference in the two positions is that the queen is not on c2. So let's just make the position completely symmetrical. Okay, and now let's play bishop g4. Okay, so this, you cannot have a more equal position than this. So that's the downside for white of playing e3. And that's what black would get after c5. Either that annoying position for white after bishop g4 or this equal position. Now, let's have a look at the most interesting move. After e3, I believe it's important to, well, punish white for not playing knight f3. And the only way to do that is to play the move e5, which knight f3 is defending against. So black continues e5. And now white doesn't really have good choices. White is basically forced to take on c4 because an exchange is about to happen in the center. And this bishop is coming to b4 and yeah, so bishop takes c4. Now there are two options for black. I'm going to show you one option which is a sideline, and then I'm going to show you the easiest option to play, which I would recommend. So the easiest option to play is ed4, and the sideline is knight to c6. Now there are two moves here. You can play knight f3, you can play queen b3. There is a game after queen b3, Wang Hao Vityugov, which Vityugov won convincingly with the black pieces, that went queen to d7, knight f3, knight a5, grabbing the bishop, queen c3, knight c4, queen c4, and now already black has the bishop pair. He has this loose pawn in the center, and after ed4 trading it off, white castles, black plays bishop d6. There are absolutely no issues for black in this position, and of course after ed4 even the material is equal, and white still has this isolated queen's pawn, but as I said, black won this game. Again, if you would like to see this, this was a China against Russia rapid match in 2010, and Vityugov won. The main line, though, is not queen b3, running into this knight a5 idea, but knight f3. And now, this line you have to know if you play knight c6, and you also have to know it if you play e3 as white. Here black should play the move e4, and this leads to a complicated position similar to the French defense in reverse, in which white has this bad bishop on c1 and black gets to play queen g5. If you are familiar with the Tarrasch French, then queen g4 for white is a common theme. White takes the e4 pawn, black takes the g2 pawn, the knight tries to trap the queen, but after bishop f1 the queen has the d5 square, and finally it has to run away a bit. But then it finds shelter back on d8, and what has black accomplished? I don't think black has accomplished much, so after both sides castle, I think the position is equal. In fact, trading off a central pawn for the g2 pawn may not be a good idea, so I would actually prefer to have white here. Therefore, after bishop c4, I wouldn't recommend the move knight c6, I would recommend simply exchanging off e takes d4. And now white can play knight f3, he doesn't have to take straight away, but that allows bishop b4 check, bishop d2, takes, queen takes, and knight f6. And after queen takes d4, queen takes d4, knight takes d4, white is, by playing the move knight f3, trying to avoid having an isolated queen's pawn. But that leaves black with a 3-2 pawn majority on the queen side, which, with the queens traded off, is a dangerous asset to have. And I would much prefer to have black here. I actually think black has greater winning chances. In the live book, 60% of the games are drawn, so let me just give you the number. 5 games played, 6 games played actually. 1 game with castles, which black won, 5 games with a6, 1 was won by white, 1 was won by black, and 3 games were drawn. So not a big advantage, but black actually scores better from this position. So ed4 instead of knight f3 I think is the principled move. Now black has a couple of options. Black could play bishop d6 or bishop b4 check, but the main move is knight f6, knights before bishops. Both other moves are okay, but I would recommend knight f6. And now white could choose to play knight f3 or knight c3. Knight c3 is a weird line which avoids developing the king's knight, and that runs into bishop d6, queen e2 check, and after queen e7, white has basically nothing better but to trade the queens. You don't want a knight on e2, basically you also don't want a king on e2. So queen e7, bishop e7, bishop f4, and c6. again, white is going to manage d5. That's not a problem. You can castle queenside straight away and push d5. It's going to be equal, but no more than equal. Again, a symmetrical pawn structure. So after knight f6, knight f3 is the principled move. Black plays bishop d6. This is where you want your bishop, basically. You can try bishop b4, but that trades off the bishops. And this bishop is, in my opinion, better than the one on c1. Both sides should now castle, and white can play h3 and then knight c3, or he could play knight c3 and then h3. The idea is to prevent bishop g4, and white wants to do the same thing, black, excuse me, wants to do the same thing, preventing bishop g5. So knight c3, knight c6, h3, h6, and now there are a couple of options. You can play a3 to give your bishop a square. You can play queen c2, controlling e4. Or you can play rook e1, which I think is the best move, simply exerting more control over e4 and developing another piece. Here black should continue with bishop f5, fairly straightforward move, and now we come to the point. Why is black equal? Well, if white does nothing, then black simply has a positional edge with this isolated queen's pawn. Let's say white does nothing for 2 moves, and let's say king f1 and I don't know, bishop to b4 and king g1 and knight e7 and king f1, and we continue with knight d5. If black can manage a blockade like this, now this is, white isn't going to allow this, but let's say this is allowed. Now black is simply better. Black has a permanent blockade. This pawn is going to be stuck here forever, and any endgame is better for black. And already black is better, not winning, but better. So in positions like these, or in this position, white has to try and push his pawn forward. When the pawn is not on e6, it's hard to liquidate your pawn, so that's another advantage for black. But what white does have is the d4 square for his knight and trying to launch an attack. So white should continue with d5. And this is a pattern you have to remember. d5 chases the knight away, and then you occupy the d4 square, chase the bishop away. So again, you have a great starting point for an attack. If black at any point pushes c6, then you trade your isolated queen's pawn off, and you still have this fine bishop on c4 on this diagonal. If not, then white is the one playing for an advantage. But again, from this position on, there's an interesting game Alireza Firouzja played against Skripchenko. I can actually show you that game. Hoping you can see this. Okay, so queen to f3 played by Firouzja, and knight h7, controlling g5, knight d to b5, chasing the bishop away, knight c8 defending the bishop, a blockade set up, bishop b3 saving the bishop, a6, preventing knight b5 in any situation, bishop f4, and what white is trying to do, he's trying to undermine d6, knight f6, the knight decides to drop back, pressure on c7, a trade, and now white starts his attack, and this is already looking slightly scary. Once the queens come off, it's arguable who has a better pawn structure. Knight a4 was played, and once this knight comes into c5, it's going to be awkward to defend both pawns. Already c7 is under pressure. If the d6 knight moves, c7 falls. If knight c5 is played, then if b6 is played, then the a6 pawn is weak. So rook d8 played, bishop d6, rook d6, knight c5 and b7 under pressure, rook b6 defending, but now simply rook e1 attacks the knight, and after knight f6, rook e7, black can basically resign. Rook d6 played and knight takes b7, and black actually did resign. So Alireza managed pressure on the queen side easily. It's not that this is going to happen every game, but that's something you should play for. And yeah, as I said, an interesting variation in which white doesn't really have much, but if he plays correctly, he's the one playing for an advantage. Okay, I hope you got something from the video. Tomorrow we are going to have a look at the main lines with knight f3, which are going to be far more complex, and there are going to be many options for both sides. And after that, moving on to other openings. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.